your hand if you're in the housing world. Raise your hand if you're in both. So if you were at the sessions yesterday, you heard a lot about how interesting it is that we're trying to merge these two worlds, the developmental disabilities world and the housing world. You guys have your own language. DD has its own language, and we're all trying to figure out how we work together. And could you do the next slide? Thank you. There you go. You think it'll click now? Okay. So in the world of developmental disabilities, most of you probably know generally what that means. Those are people with significant lifelong disabilities that begin early in childhood and are expected to last their lifetime. But there are some interesting aspects to adults with developmental disabilities that are important when you're looking at housing issues. One is that people with developmental disabilities tend to, generally on average, have a basic source of income through SSI, which means that they're living on about, right now, in Washington anyway, on average $991 a month. That means that at $300 a month, someone is rent burdened. And so that basic factor, as we've learned, as we go into the housing world, means that we're in a very small category of available housing, that it is difficult to develop housing at that level. Most people with developmental disabilities are also, 30 to 40% of people with developmental disabilities have a concurrent mental health diagnosis. About 15% of people with developmental disabilities that are in supported living services have really high behavior support needs. And so, that means they often don't get along well with a roommate. They have to have a specialized environment sometimes for them to be most independent. And that requires that we're creative about the housing structures that they live in. And the groups of people that they might live with. You know, when you can only contribute $300 a month toward your rent, logically, people often have to share expenses. So people with developmental disabilities often have to live together in order to be able to sustain a living situation. In addition, when we add residential services in, residential services are often provided by a provider, and having a couple of people in the same vicinity tends to work out. So we need to think about all those things when we're designing housing. And then an interesting statistic, about 30% of people with developmental disabilities have hoarding behaviors, turns out. And that's a significant issue to consider when you're looking at housing someone with a developmental disability. Okay, I'm gonna try it and see if it works. There, oh, wrong way. There we go. So one of the factors that we have to think about too for people with developmental disabilities is that about 70% to 80% of people with IDD live with their families. They live with their families throughout their lifetime. Families are the long-term support network for people with developmental disabilities. And when that doesn't work out, as families start to age or families have their own circumstances and they can't care for someone with a developmental disability, that's when the system has to kick in to start to plan. We know that in Washington state, we expect about 170,000 people with developmental disabilities to live in our state. Our Washington DDA system has only identified about 50,000, and only about 35,000 get one service or more. So you can imagine that there are a lot of people with developmental disabilities who are not in the system that are also trying to navigate housing issues and live independently in the community. We know that there are also about 2,000, and that's probably an underestimate, adults with developmental disabilities living with senior families. So that means the family member, at least one family member caring for that person, is over the age of 65. And those of you who are my age or more in this room know that we have a large generation of people that are starting to age, a bigger bump than in a lot of other generations, and that we have to plan for when they are no longer able to care for their son or daughter. And in most situations, because of the service configuration and the funding level in most developmental disability services, that it puts parents in a situation where they cannot plan. Crisis happens, and then we're all scrambling to make sure that someone gets access to housing or residential services. I don't think the clicker's working. So there we go. So Yesterday, if you were here, you heard about Eco Northwest study. That's where it all started for us in terms of our advocacy. The Cooney Foundation did an amazing job starting a study that looked at the need for people with developmental disabilities in housing. Washington State then got some legislative funding to make that very specific to Washington State. And we have a report that highlights very clearly the need. So we know that there are about 37,000 people with developmental disabilities that we can identify that are in need of housing. That means they also need that triangle, right? Residential services and a good workforce. But the housing is what's most critical. And at this point, we have about 1,382 units that are identified for people with developmental disabilities. You can imagine that there's a lot of scrambling going on to get access to one of those units, and that we need more of them, and we need to look carefully as we're building it. So what kind of units do we need? Next slide, please. So one of the things that we figured out as we dove into the housing world in Washington State, like your state probably, as we were deinstitutionalizing, we had a state referendum to build about 80 group homes. Back then, that was 8 people living together in a big HUD-funded, larger scattered site, single-family home in a neighborhood. Those group homes have aged over time. We have about 40 of them left. And they're still working, they're still functional, but 40. You saw those statistics. And what we've learned through that process is people with developmental disabilities are not monolithic. They come and have a lot of abilities, preferences, and needs. And the housing market has to be as accommodating and flexible and varietal as it would be for all of us in this room. I can imagine if we took a poll. Some of us live in a house, some in an apartment, some have shared living situations, some people live alone. We have to have those same options for people with developmental disabilities. So we have been pushing hard for what we call scattered site housing. That means single family, duplexes, and triplexes throughout the community, but also looking at the needs of families. So low income housing that accommodates families raising a child with a developmental disability, and individuals who are more independent, who want to work and live in the community and don't need as many supports. So you can imagine as many housing configurations as I just described to meet those needs. When you look at scattered site housing, single family homes, duplexes, and triplexes, what we know is it's more expensive. It's more expensive to build. You heard a couple of models yesterday. It may be more expensive for a while to build the kind of units that we're looking for until we figure this out as well. What we know is that when smaller nonprofits get in this game, not big developers, they could be tax credits, it's harder for them to sustainably develop housing. They don't benefit from the tax credits. And because we're looking at folks who are below 30% AMI, and we can only charge $300 or so a month, you can adjust the rent for maintenance and operations, preservation, all those kinds of things. And so that's been a conundrum for us as we get more small developers in the game, knowing that we need more variety, things that are more specific to the needs of our population. Generally speaking, though, I'm not going to say we're only looking at small development. We want big developers to come in. And some of those folks were in the room yesterday as well. And I've gone to places like Mercy Housing and explained our conundrum, and they're compassionate, wonderful people who say, well, we want to help. Where can we build you 300 units just for people with IDD? And then we say, well, by the time you add in residential services, that looks like an institution. We can't do that. So we've got to find a way to pull in big developers, meet the needs, and then also allow small developers to get in the game. That also means that we have to look at funding sources that are based on grants and not loans, or forgivable loans at least. And so we've been working really closely with our Department of Commerce to try to make sure that we're promoting new funding through a source that looks at grants and not loans. Next slide, please. So our housing needs, as I mentioned, we've been pushing pretty hard for single family homes, duplexes, and triplexes. We want to make sure that there's room for overnight staff, for parking for staff, making sure that there's some noise mitigation, access to transportation. We want to make sure there's a variety for families, low-income family homes, down payment assistance, home ownership programs, and good rental assistance. Housing vouchers, which if I believe what I heard yesterday, you have a lot more housing vouchers than we do. And so we're really hard pressed to get more of that in Washington. And then adapting our waivers so that it includes housing support. Next slide, please. So here are some of the things that we've been working on. In Washington State, we have a DD set aside within our housing trust fund. And on average, over the last decade, it's been funded between $3 and $5 million a year. You can imagine that builds a couple of houses, especially if you live in King County. And this last legislative session, because of all of our efforts in our capital budget, we were awarded $25 million just dedicated to developmental disabilities housing. And we know that that's going to get spent. We know that there's a great demand and that the applications for that just closed in the last couple of weeks. And we're positioned to ask for much more. We also worked on this, in our state, we split adult aging services from developmental disabilities, but we have adult family home models that are licensed differently than we have in developmental disabilities. And so we looked at tax credits for adult family home models and a specialty so that an adult family home model is just not for seniors, that it anticipates younger people with developmental disabilities living together, working in the community, and having a more active lifestyle, that is not someone just in their home all day long being cared for. And so there's a pilot project that the Developmental Disabilities Administration is working on. We've also advocated to change our waivers so that housing navigation and housing stabilization can be included. That has not happened yet, but certainly in conversation. Boosting the number of developers for our housing needs, which is why we're here. Working with Commerce greatly. I'm excited to have Nate Lichty on because he's been a great partner for us in Washington State. And then we got an interesting assessment. So we, through a special fund in Washington State, have something called the Dan Thompson account. And that funded a free residential assessment for people with developmental disabilities. And it's a litany of questions, 100 questions or so. You know, what are your resources? What kind of housing are you looking at? What stage of your life are you in? And how do we work with you and your family or your natural supporters to be able to move you into the community successfully? And this assessment is sort of that launch point, and it's free to 6,800 people across the state right now while it's funded. And it was a great tool for us. Next slide, please. So these are just resources that I wanted to make sure and provide in our PowerPoint. So you have them, those two studies that I mentioned, the legislative reports and the free residential assessment. We are fortunate, you know, every legislature is different. We have a couple of good champions in our legislature around housing that have really come around and come to understand developmental disabilities. And so we're pushing really hard. This particular legislator, and I feel bad I left out this slide, is looking at something called a real estate excise tax for us. And could you do the next slide just to make sure? I might not have mentioned that in the next one. No, that's it. So we have a bill that didn't pass last year, but is being modified that we think will be the solution to funding for our housing if it passes. So it's a real estate excise tax that has a complicated formula I'm not going to be able to explain, but there's a section in there around developmental disabilities housing. And over time, and that'll be one of the things that gets adjusted, it will generate up to $40 million a year for housing for developmental disabilities, but it has some cool things in it. And because I left the slide out, I wrote down some of those component parts. So that fund will be established separately and is for acquisition, development, and construction of housing, permanent housing. And that includes adding new units and existing structures. 15% of all the projects can be for non-resident spaces to promote successful community living. It can go toward preservation, operations, and maintenance, which is critical. Housing-related services, rental subsidies, and really importantly, technical assistance for nonprofits to expand this pool of developers that we're trying to cultivate. It will all be given in the form of forgivable grants or loans. And it could include tenant support, relocation, eviction support, finding and locating the housing that you need. So we feel like it's really robust. We'll be tracking that carefully this legislative session. We hope it'll serve as a model for your state or other states potentially, because we need this ongoing sustainable amount, or we find ourselves just begging for capital dollars every year. And I don't know if we'll be as fortunate each time. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues. I can't remember if Nate is next. Nate's next. Okay, Nate, take it away. He's online. He's going to show up magically.
Good morning, Oregon. I am flying blind, so if someone can give me an indication that my audio is okay, I'd appreciate it.
Can you hear me? Hi, Nate.
Hey, Stacy, I can hear you now. Yeah. So it sounds like my audio is coming through. Looks like the screen's lagging a little bit.
It says remove.
Well, IT works a little bit. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Nate Lichty, Managing Director of the Multifamily Housing Unit here at Commerce. I was really looking forward to being there. I appreciate the invitation from the Cooney Foundation, but logistics and work demands here prevented me. It was no offense to housers in Oregon. I was really looking forward to networking and getting to know you firsthand. So I'll share a few highlights, but I know our partners with DSHS have some additional content to add. So if you can advance the slide, looks like, would it be advantageous for me to share my screen? Okay. Looks like you've got it. So Department of Commerce, if you're unfamiliar with Washington State, we have a pretty broad mandate. We've got housing and homeless programs, but we also, typical with kind of commerce agencies, economic development, trade, energy, planning, infrastructure, and broadband are all also part of the agency. So we fit in a sector that has a lot of community services and affordable housing, but we intersect with a lot of other industries and sectors. You can advance the slide. The two things that we at Commerce administer that really connects with and serves the IDD community include our housing trust fund, which I will talk more about, but we also do have a behavioral health facilities fund that creates licensed facilities and is available for organizations. So we are always trying to navigate and help organizations who are interested in providing residential facilities or housing with the right capital bucket. You could advance the slide a little bit. It illustrates a little bit of the deviation and the room that we have, where we are with the Housing Trust Fund emphasizing and focusing on permanent supportive housing to the greatest extent possible. So supportive housing for multitude of populations. Then we also have emergency. I'm going from right to left, ironically. But the gray area are a range of facilities that we also fund. We do group homes and shelters. We have transitional housing. But then we do refer for facilities that are on the left to the Behavioral Health Facilities Fund. And sometimes, and I think there's one example in my slide deck that gets pretty close to that gray or to that blue-gray category. And we're working as a division on updating our definitions in our handbook to comply with changes in the licensing and the community needs. So if we go to the next slide, the Housing Trust Fund has been in existence for over 35 years. We have invested over $2 billion, served the entire state, serve a range of populations that that this, of course, population fits in. Go ahead and advance the slide. And Stacy did a great job of providing an overview of how the state has generally funded a set aside for IDD populations. So we typically would have $3 to $5 million reserved. The overall funding allocation has tripled from 2019 to 21, 21 to 23, and we are at 400 million total for the 23 to 25 biennium. But we do, but there are advocates for the REIT and for other additional funding for capital for affordable housing. So it is a very prominent statewide initiative. And we don't lose sight of the importance of IDD housing as the overall basket of housing and housing investment gets underway. So we partner with the experts on conducting the review and determination of what type of housing is most appropriate. We make sure that all housing serving this population participates and works with DDA on the referral, and that the operating supports that DDA administers are vital to the sustainability of many projects. And I've got some slides about the types of different projects that we've had and some of the pathways that we've utilized to get there. Next slide, please. And there was a record investment in 21-23. We had 15 million available in traditional funding that we were targeting for the IDD. We've carried over 1.6 of that so that we could fund more projects in the current round. But this Dan Thompson pathway, the funds that were restricted, I always like to highlight that because this had a very special involvement of the Developmental Disabilities Commission and persons with lived experience in the review of projects. So typically we just received our traditional applications, and we do a very robust deep dive of the project design, of its readiness, due diligence, and we refer the service portion to DDA for the review of the supportive services. With the Dan Thompson Fund, they had 50 million that wasn't restricted to housing. It was to serve the population. And members of the DDC specifically said, we need housing and we want to allocate 15 million, about a third of it to housing. Ultimately, DSHS worked closely with us to transfer those projects and those funds to Commerce, which was a new form of partnership, and we're very excited about administering those. And we've gotten new projects in the pipeline and new developers in the pipeline because of that. If we go, so I'm going to highlight a few of the projects that we've funded in recent history, and then I think I'll get a summary slide and we'll pass it back to the panel there on site. So the next slide highlights Mercy Angle Lake, some Mercy housing, which I believe is pretty, maybe they're in the room. Mercy, if you're there, good to see you. But this is an exciting project. It's a TOD project, transit-oriented development project, and they're developing 130 units, and 20% of them are set aside for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we're very excited about seeing, part of this is the commercial component is also going to house ARC of King County's offices. So we think that this is a great model to integrate and provide high quality housing, affordable housing to the IDD community, while also giving access to a lot of resources that are available because of the development location. The next slide is actually this made it in because it's a prominent developer. Parkview Services, one of our major developers. They primarily do scattered site, but they had a specific need to do a stabilization and intervention facility. And so they have 24-hour support. This is one that is a licensed facility, but it was a legislative direct appropriation that sent this project, funded this project for us. We added competitive funds to it, but it's going to be available here with some final rehab, and will be placed in service shortly. The next one is, as Stacy referenced, integrating these homes into, could advance the slide please, to VADIS. VADIS is a new grant recipient from the Housing Trust Fund. They came through the Dan Thompson program. So they're purchasing about 10 homes, and they are going to be doing, sorry, I looked at the wrong slide. Okay. They're going to be doing, providing a number of beds, but we're partially excited about the expansion of housing in neighborhoods, the single family model. We needed more providers available to provide that. It's a tough model to sustain, but we know that it's a really desirable option. And the last project I'll highlight is in Bremerton on the peninsula. Arc of the Peninsulas is a new provider. You could advance the slide, please. They are, this is their first housing project. So they've partnered with the Bremerton Housing Authority to get the consulting supports, but they're going to be building a new development. And they've over 50% or 10 of the 22 units will be reserved for persons with intellectual developmental disabilities. And the state is fully funding the project. So the referral from the Dan Thompson funds was able to get this project underway. And I believe we just executed the contract and should be going into construction here shortly. So the last slide that I'll hit is, we have this portfolio of projects that have served the population, and we have had some challenges with maintaining occupancy. So we've had to, needs have changed. The accommodations couldn't house 3 bedrooms anymore. We needed a bedroom for either caregiver, for equipment, or the acuity of certain individuals. So we've worked and we've been flexible with our providers on maintaining that. We also contribute portfolio preservation investments, so grants to do rehab. And we also are always working hard on accommodations and modifications and consulting with DSHS on what is needed. So we do emphasize durable construction and design standards, accessibility, and we have been making efforts to streamline the Housing Trust Fund application. We have a combined funders application that is recognized by and utilized by a dozen public funders. And so making changes in the underwriting and the application is an ordeal. But I know that the 40+ page application that we do submit can be really daunting for nonprofits. So we've been also working to invest in bringing on technical assistance consultants so that we can provide the support for applicants and helping build the capacity of organizations. So we understand there is a continuum of housing and residential facility needs. And so we're very interested in supporting and working with the Arc of Washington and stakeholders on where those investments need to be. And we're very proud of the partnership and the opportunity to work with the communities on that. I think I have one last announcement that Stacy referred to. Our applications were closed about a week and a half ago. And so no one knows, we haven't publicized the list of applicants, but I just referred to it, and we received 87 applications. And this year, we have 20 of them that are committing to serving the IDD community. So I don't have a unit count. We don't have total fund requests information yet, but I think that it's a very prominent success story to say that almost 1 in 4 properties that are developments that are applying for funds are pledging to serve this population. So with that, I'll thank you. My contact information is on the slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out, but I will sit back and enjoy the presentation from the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nate. Department of Commerce. And we are the Developmental Disabilities Administration. Sheng Fong is our unit manager, our first and only dedicated housing person for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. Yes, big. It was big. So historically, I work for DSHS as well, Developmental Disabilities Administration. I've been kind of the unofficial point person for housing related matters because primarily, as Stacy alluded to, DSHS provides support services, right? 24-hour support services, in-home supports, personal care, supported living services in the community. And unlike Oregon, we still do have 4 state institutions, although they've been steadily downsizing over the last 40 years. In fact, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, we had more than 4,000 people in 6 state institutions in Washington state. Today, there's 4 that are still standing, but they only support about 500. Conversely, we have more than 4,000 people in the community in our most intensive residential program, and that's called supported living in Washington state. And that is the support service. So it's not the housing, it is generic housing owned, leased, or subleased by the clients, by the people, right? So, and we've had a big disconnect historically between the housing, which was just regular landlords, either market rate or, if we're lucky, affordable housing. We have benefited, and you've heard from Nate, you've heard from Stacy, we have benefited from this housing trust fund in Washington state, which is really unique in that they have a specific DD set aside, which is what Nate was just talking about, which has been really cool. It's been $3 to $5 million a year, specifically earmarked for people with developmental disabilities, which isn't a huge amount of money until now. So now all of a sudden there's a lot of momentum and an awareness that that the state, meaning DSHS and developmental disabilities, really needs to have a more unified approach to housing and support services and not work in silos, and not be completely hands-off in the world of affordable housing. Because the reality is that support services obviously are a huge part of that, up to 24-hour in-home support. But if we don't have any kind of role with the affordable housing and the quality of the housing and the affordability of the housing, then the quality of life for the people we support is not where it needs to be. So that awareness is finally coming around, again, with the hiring of Sheng and a new unit. So that was very good. The legislature acted this year and also funded 2 additional FTEs, which is why we now have a unit. In fact, I say we have a unit, but we haven't hired Sheng's first staff person yet. We're close, right? Next week, I believe. So that's really good news. But just in terms of the overall, you guys have heard a little bit about the overall, but what we have done, I think we've been pretty progressive in a lot of respects, even though we have the 4 institutions, right? We have been doing supported living services and building tenant support and in-home type support services up to 24-hour since the 80s, right? So basically, we have more than 4,000 people that have very intensive, most of whom have very intensive support needs, but they live in regular single family homes. So the Housing Trust Fund primarily that we've been involved with since 1991, that's how long we've had the set aside, has been to build scattered single family home, just regular homes like anybody would live in. Not so much apartments, although we have some apartment stock. And those are usually in connection with larger affordable housing projects where maybe 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20% are set aside for developmental disabilities. But most of what we have done is supported our community residential providers who support the clients in those generic housing where our clients' names are on the lease, just like you or I would be, because we've really valued the idea that this is just integrated, inclusive housing, not congregate care, not large institutions. In fact, we haven't supported those types of proposals where they congregate 200-300 people with developmental disabilities in a single place, right? Because that starts to look like an institution, or even 15 or 20, too many, right? And even in those apartment complexes that we support up to 20%, we ask that those units are integrated throughout the apartment complex, not like the DD wing over on the south side kind of thing, because inclusion and integration is of the utmost value within developmental disabilities in Washington State. So here's a couple examples of some housing that was recently developed, I believe, over in Spokane. But that's really what we've been doing since '91. As I mentioned, I think we've developed about 1,500 units, and by a unit I mean a bedroom. And so for most of the people we support in our supported living program, they average about three clients per home, and then that's staffed around the clock. So it's not a group home. Again, they're on the lease with a landlord that's independent from the service provider, and they staff it around the clock. So they provide the support services, but it's really is the client's home. The client owns the home, the client pays the cable bill. And what we found though is that being completely hands-off from the landlord 100% as the state has been challenging over time, even with the affordable housing development. Over time, the quality of the homes has gone down, right? There's been maintenance issues and there's been those kinds of things. So we have an increased role now. We have some strategy around getting more involved on the housing front so that the quality of the houses, as well as the support services, are there together. And Shung's going to jump in and talk a little bit more about our strategy and how the time is ripe right now for Washington State, because we have the legislature's attention thanks to advocates like the ARC, like the DDC, who have been at the forefront of this whole thing with the legislature, and a couple of legislators that are really excited about this, and an unprecedented time in terms of a lack of affordability and the fact that our clients simply cannot afford market rate. The vast majority of the people we support cannot live in Seattle, can't live in, Olympia, Vancouver, Spokane. So this is needed, and hopefully we're going to help improve things. Right, Sean?
Thank you, Joel. Yes. So I'm going to go over some data we find through our two studies. So here's some overview picture for the DD housing part in Washington State. So we have quite a lot of DD populations living in Washington State, and the number showing here probably is not like 100% accurate, because we know lots of people who has DD conditions was not get enrolled into DDA service. So this is based on a population-based calculation from the ACO Northwest. So over the last 30 years, we are able to create about, now it's about like 1,500 DD units for DD population. Well, we see the unmet needs is still huge. And if the housing market situations keep going up, the prices keep going up, probably the gap, if we don't take any actions, probably the gap will getting bigger and bigger. So that's a story. And talk about the fund we are able to get. So this is the data we collected from 2021 to 2023. So we can see Washington State invest quite a lot of funding to support the overall affordable housing development. Well, for us, we are the small piece of the pie, the blue part. So it's about like 2 or 3% of the total funding. So in order to meet our clients' needs, we definitely, you can see, we want to increase the ratio of the fund we can receive. And thanks for our partnership with the Department of Commerce, the ARC, and other DD organizations like DDC. So we are successfully presented this need and data to the legislature, and we do get responding. And so for this year, we actually, the DD set aside money is almost like 4 times more than previous year. So for this 2 years, we get $25 million set aside to develop affordable, accessible units for DD. Strategy. So how should we allocate those funds? So to serve the DD population, what's the most urgent need for our population, for our community? The other one is we collaborate with Eco Northwest. So talk about the overall housing needs or unmet housing needs in Washington State for the DD community. Okay, so here are some key suggestions we made through those 2 reports. And we think it works pretty good. And some of the suggestions is we're starting to see it's happening there. So the first one that we see, obviously it's happening. So we want to increase and prioritize the DD housing trust fund through the Department of Commerce. So during the past 2 years, we really build up a strong working relationship with the Department of Commerce. And now, so we have this $25 million set aside for DD housing, and DDA deeply participate in the DD housing application review process as well. So that's a really good thing happening there. And also we created a separate DD housing application pool. So previously, our developers need to compete with large developers. So for example, we have developers want to build like a 2 single-family home, and they need to compete with those large developers who are building like hundreds of units. So that put our developers in a very disadvantaged position. So now we are successfully to set aside. So we compare the apple with apples instead of compare the apple with oranges now. So this is really encouraging news to our developers. So we can see the first 2, now we are making it happening. And the third one is we realized traditionally the housing trust fund is provided in the form of loan. So low interest, deferrable loan. Well, that actually adds some financial burden on our developers. So what we're trying to advocate is to explore the possibility to find more like a grant-based money to support our developers. So that make their financial situation much stronger. That will. And we also want to develop the long-term DD housing strategy. So currently, so as Sean mentioned, I was the first one hired folks on the housing part. So we really want to see what's going to happen in the future, what we can do to support our DD clients in 5 years, in 10 years, what's best strategy for us. And we are working on that, and we get some great outlines, and Shaw will share that information with you. And the last one is an ongoing one. So we have a dream. So in the future, in Washington State, we have a statewide database established. So whenever a client need to find affordable housing, so we just go to one stop. This is one-stop shop. So we just go through there and enter the housing need, and then the information will pop out, including the available housing units in there, and also include the matching corresponding service providers information in there. Because we know for our people, for our community, so we need the house, and in the meantime, we definitely need the services to go with the house. So it's not just something like, okay, so this is the key for the house, then there you go. So we need to pair it up with a service. So hopefully we can get this kind of database established, also including, if possible, including the federal HUD housing voucher information in there. So that's also an important part we want to explore. Okay, so currently we're working for two major types of affordable housing sources for our community. So the first one is through the partnership with the Commerce. So Nate just introduced that model. So Nate is our best friend because he is always taking care of the bills for us. So that's a housing trust fund. So this model, the good thing is once we created those units, it became a permanent affordable unit for our community. So it will usually last 30 years, 40 years commitment. So no other voucher needed. So it's basically set up there and it looks like if we have vacancy there, we refer another DD clients to move into that house. So that's first type. Second type is the one we want to expand. So currently, we don't have a whole lot of connections or success with the housing subsidy program, but we feel that's a very important approach as well. For example, from the federal level, we have 811. We have we have general, like previous called Section 8 housing vouchers. And the condition is the waiting list is really, really long. Probably if we have clients have a housing need now, probably till the next conference housing Oregon happening, they're still on the waiting list. So that's the situation. So we try to collaborate with local housing authorities to expand the possibility of getting more like housing subsidy vouchers for our community. Or we call it like a project-based housing voucher project. So we find a housing authority and we find a local housing developer and we work together to build a house, and this house get the vouchers, and the voucher will stay with this house and just for the qualified DD clients. So that's our goal. Yeah. So some general data. So both Stacy and Nate shared this information. So overall, we are able to work together with Commerce, creating the last 2-year run. We created about 65 affordable housing units for our community. So this is a good win because previously we may only get like 10, 12 units created every 2 years. And beside, oops. We go back to the, okay. Yeah, so also last year we are lucky. So because we get some extra help from the Dan Thompson account, so we were able to doing the innovative way to collaborate with Commerce, with Dan Thompson account, with DDC, and use some of the money from that account to create some extra like 70-ish DD units for our community. Yeah. So now we're going to have Shaw, would you like to talk about our vision and our future strategy for how to better serve our community?
Yeah, maybe we can do it together, Sean.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to read it because it's been a while. Let's see. Sufficient housing development and service delivery coordination necessary to support an affordable and accessible housing solution for every person with developmental disabilities in Washington State who needs it. So that's the vision, right? It starts with a vision. And it's really about, it's beyond integration for us, power and choice. We have some guiding values within developmental disabilities, and they include power and choice, community inclusion, status, relationships. And a lot of that is driven by supporting people across the lifespan, right? Where they are, and provide sufficient service and supports when they need it. And we have gaps right now. There's no question that we have gaps. For example, we've had a lot of media attention around people stuck in the hospital. I don't know if Oregon's had that problem, but we have clients with dual diagnosis, mental health issues, developmental disabilities that might end up in local emergency rooms and hospital rooms. And sometimes in the worst case scenario, they might be there 6 months or longer, right? And we all agree that's unacceptable. And we can scream and holler that we need housing, that housing is housing. And so we're finally starting to get things moving on that. And what we know is that we need a spectrum of housing options for people. It's not one-stop shopping, right? It's not these single family homes that we've done historically isn't going to work for every one of our clients, particularly clients that are in crisis. And one of the problems is you have 2 clients that are finally stable in a home, single family home, and there's a referral made for somebody that's very clinically complex and might have extremely challenging behaviors, who historically might have been institutionalized or even in mental health institution, something like that. But now there's increased pressure for DDA to accept those individuals into the community, but the providers that we contract with do not want to disrupt the household, understandably, or destabilize the other clients. So what do you do about that? So then there's another unique need for short-term and transitional type housing within developmental disabilities that we haven't done a lot of in the past. So we're starting to explore those models. But what we really need is a solid strategy. So that is a strategic plan is now on our agenda, and we'll be hiring 2 additional staff for Dr. Fong's unit here in the next month or so. And one of the first things we're going to do is start on that strategic plan. I have a cartoon that's in my office that hangs on the wall. It's a couple of guys sitting in a bar, and they're just having a beer. One guy turns to the other guy and he says, "You just pissing and moaning, or you got data to back that up?" And so that's what our strategic plan really is needed for. We need to be able to say in a very prescriptive way, we do have it, the people we support do have an affordable housing support need. This is what it needs to look like. This is the demographic breakdown. This will enhance our credibility and entice those funders to continue to invest in these different options. So that's kind of the vision and generally the strategy. Xiong, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so we think in order to realize our dream, so the most important strategy is going to be we're going to build a really strong working relationship with other partners. So we actually list out that one in our action plan. So the very first one is community outreach and collaboration. So that's actually going to be our secret to success. And today we share this secret with all your wonderful people here, and we're going to keep it in mind. So the most important thing is we reach out to find your own Nate, who is going to pay your bill, and we reach out to find your own Stacy to speak for you, to speak to the legislator, to talk with them, to educate them, and you're going to find your Terry to build the house for you and to provide service for you. And this is never going to be a task that one single agent can accomplish. You got to build up your team, your dream team to accomplish this task. And also Sean mentioned, we're going to hire 2 additional housing program manager, and we're going to use their talents to build really strong connections with local people, local agents, local resources, to find every penny we can use to build our affordable housing units for our community. And I'm going to go over one, and then we'll invite Sean to talk about the rest. So we want to expand our accessible, affordable housing capacity. As Sean and Nate and Stacy mentioned, luckily we have about 1,500 accessible, affordable housing units for our community. And our housing needs per last year report is 37,000. So we need much more units there. So in order to increase the capacity, we keep an open mind. So we focus on the scattered single family house, and we want definitely have more people to jump into this field and create more single family house for us. In the meantime, we keep an open attitude. So any type of affordable, accessible units for our community, we are welcome. So for example, apartment, duplex, triplex, ADU, large house, small house, rainbow house, we welcome every one of them. So all types of them. And we also want to support our developers to be success, to avoid like a financial collapse, because we know our clients, their income is really low. So general affordable housing, the lowest part is for the 30% of AMI. Well, most of our clients get an income below that line. So some of them is just about 15% of AMI. So we want to create some resources to support our developers to make sure they get a strong cash flow to help support them, to help make this whole affordable housing program like sustainable. So we don't want to see any of our developers file bankruptcy to the court. So that's something we want to avoid.
Well put, Sean. I think in the consideration of time, we need to get our partner Terry up here to do her piece. Time goes so fast on this topic, we could talk all day, right? But Terry, you're up.
You inspire me. It's great. And I am not even going to try to attempt to advance the slides. Could you please help me and move to South Hill Commons? So good morning. My name is Terry Silvas. I'm the CEO of Horizon Project. We're a provider agency in Umatilla County, Oregon. We have I actually have about 25 years in affordable housing development and finance. So I came to the service world about 7 years ago and blew my mind. So what I found, and if you were in the sessions yesterday, you heard this, we in our housing world have one nomenclature, and you in the DD world, we in the DD world have another. And just finding ways to talk to each other with the same language is the first challenge. And what I wanted to start with, because I thought I knew what I was going to say, and now I have to say it really fast. But my colleagues from Washington blew my mind. I didn't know exactly what they were going to say. But I want to throw out 2 misconceptions. Number one, that people with IDD come with rental assistance. Developers think that's true. It's not true. People that with IDD automatically qualify for permanent supportive housing units. That is not true. We're excluded, apparently, and I'm going to use a phrase that I heard this morning. A lot of the people we support are not homeless enough, which is outrageous as a statement. Thank you for sharing that with me, Robin. And here are the things that we don't have in Oregon. We don't have a dedicated money source outside of our little Fairview Trust dollars. We do not have incentives for including people with IDD in our housing policy and funding plan. We do not have a planning or strategic outlook for a plan for how to create IDD housing in Oregon. We do not have a vision or a strategy. We do not have a open communication channel between ODDS and OHCS. We do not have qualifications for IDD specifically to get certain types of rental assistance. That is what we do not have even though we don't have institutions. And you know, I asked why I was on this panel and now I'm just fired up. So thank you. So that's good. Woo. But we do have a lot of committed providers who are doing work in spite of the fact that we do not have a lot of the tools that you have created. Thank you. So, so I'm going to talk about that. So again, I work in rural Eastern Oregon. Umatilla County is our focus. We have 16 to 18, depending on the day, residential group homes run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We have supported living, we have employment supports, and job coaching and placement. We do community living supports. We do day supports. So we are the kind of the largest holistic provider in the region. We have over 200 staff and we support our head count per program enrollment, although some of these are duplicative, are about 150 to 175, depending on who's enrolled when. What we don't have a lot of is affordable, this sounds familiar, affordable integrated housing. So I was a consultant with Horizon Project 20 some odd years ago and created a small integrated housing complex called Pioneer Commons in Milton Freewater, Oregon. At the time, no one knew what that was. We got it funded and built, and that was where it sat. And so fast forward 25 years, I'm now CEO of Horizon Project. We've restructured that because it was needing some love physically. And we are now in the middle of building our first larger integrated housing complex in Pendleton, Oregon. We're doing this without a lot of the dedicated funding. So South Hill Commons is 70 units of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments on the South Hill of Pendleton, Oregon. And we will be building on, I'm not going to go through the complex land use process, but integrated within that is a 3-bedroom group home that is wholly owned by Horizon Project. And Horizon Project has a series of LLCs, which I will not describe, that makes us basically the owner and operator and developer. And I have some really good development partners on this. So this is a vision of what we think it will be. We've used universal design with the help of Fairview Trust dollars and Cooney Foundation dollars to enhance the design. The city of Pendleton badly wanted and has been working hard to get housing across all continuum of incomes. And so has been beating on me since I started at Horizon to build affordable housing. And I finally said, okay, I got my feet under me. I think I know what I can do. I said, but anything we do has to have inclusionary housing for people living with IDD. And they're like, great, let's go. I said, okay. So they gave us some land, about 4 acres on a hill. It's the most expensive free land I ever got. We got like $2 million in site development. We have 16-foot retaining walls because what we're doing is minimizing stairs. We got a ramp system that is crazy. It's beautiful. Kind of almost right now looks like Eastern European block construction. Yeah, it's going to look better once the buildings are painted. But lots of concrete work. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of the site plan. You see all those ramps kind of meandering around. We have several buildings. We have 4 residential buildings and a community center. The community center is on the right in the middle. That will also have universal design principles included. Everything is designed to minimize barriers of all sites for people of all abilities. All the doors in all the units are 36-inch wide. So anybody that might need a wheelchair or, end up with a walker is not going to have trouble getting through. I'm going to forget all the universal design principles. So if someone thinks of one, just call them out. Let's see. We will have wayfinding. Of course, we're going to have IT. We're talking now about what kind of technology most would benefit individuals. I will say one thing I was distressed about, but there's no way around it. All the 1-bedrooms are in one building, but that doesn't mean all individuals living with IDD will be in one building. We can serve families with children with IDD. We can serve roommates. And I suspect, given the need for veterans and just affordable housing in general, even our 1-bedrooms that are in that one of the buildings over near the community center will be integrated because there's just a lot of need on all levels. So I'm really hoping that we get families too that will apply for some of our IDD preserved units. And I want to speak a moment about set-asides side as a social service agency, people will talk about that, meaning we really want these housing units to be preserved for people living with IDD. In the housing world, what I think is, and what we think is, that means they're restricted for that. And if I've got a lease-up problem, I got an operational problem because I can no longer put those units in service. So what I do, and what I've done here, is I have created a preference for individuals living with IDD with the extreme desire to make sure that we affirmatively market hard and fast to make sure that happens. We have a preference for between 8 and 10 in this 70-unit complex and more if that works. And if we fill up before our goal, then we put the next available unit ready, and our rental criteria plan, our rent-up plan, allows the next person with IDD that applies to bump to the top of the wait list. So I think those are again part of the nomenclature that we're all having to learn together. I think I'm out of time. Did I talk fast enough? Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our amazing panel. We are technically over time by 3 minutes, but if you're willing to take one question, would you be willing? Is that okay, Daniel? All right. Any questions? One question right in the front.
Hi, I've heard several times over the last 2 days that there's a prohibition on service providers owning the buildings, and I don't know where that comes from. And I'm curious to know if it was a conscious policy choice, and if so, what the rationale was.
Yeah, that's a great question. And all the models aren't that way. So there's facility-based, so if we're talking about the community, right? Community-based services. We have facility-based models, and then we have non-facility-based models. So for DDA, at least in Washington State, we've instituted policy where the support service provider for a supported living program can't also be the owner operator. There's some exceptions, right, which require review, and we need to ensure that they have the same standards and that the clients have the same rights, with regard to tenant rights, notice and things like that, and that it's not operating like an institution, that sort of thing. But generally, that's the supported living model is the one that where we have about 4,000 people with pretty intense support needs, where it has to be an independent landlord. But whereas we have licensors still, we have licensed group homes, not very many. Would you say about 40, Stacy, that are still out there? The adult family home model that we share with aging, we use in Washington State, that's a licensed model, and most of those adult family homes are owned or operated, right? And they serve, it used to be up to 6, and now there's opportunity for up to 8. But that's a licensed model that's regulated by DSHS as well, and that's considered integrated by CMS, and it's perfectly acceptable. So it's really tied to the model.
You don't mind. It's a little bit different in Oregon, not much, but there's a couple of nuances. We have many more group homes because Fairview Trust, all institutions were closed so many years ago. And of course now, like I said, we've got between 16 and 18 and 20, depending on what we're doing. And we own we have a master lease on a couple, but we generally own our group homes. Now, supported living, we are allowed to own apartments that also provide supported living. Doesn't necessarily mean that like in South Hill Commons, we are an ownership entity, but anyone can live there, living with IDD, with their families, with their personal support worker at brokerages. And if we do support someone living in one of our units that we control, we follow fair housing law. You know, so we got the lease, we got the protections, and they sign a approved, you know, tenant lease that adheres to all the laws with the protections of anyone else.
Thank you, everyone. We're out of time. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at the next session on ADUs.